Whether you're new to PC building or have a lot of experience, the question is always, what parts do I buy? Well, here's a guide to help you with that. So before you even start shopping for parts, you want to find a good reputable store, like Scorptech, which I personally love. M-Wave, yeah, they're pretty good, and PC Case Gear, I've had some good experiences with them. So the first thing that you want to figure out is sort of budget, whether you're going for $300 or maybe even upwards of $3,000. That's always a good place to start. This will tell you how much performance you'll get and what PC parts you'll pick in general. The place I like to start is the motherboard, and this will determine a lot of decisions in your PC, such as what CPU you're using. Now for CPUs there are two parts, AMD or Intel. It doesn't really matter if you're going AMD or Intel, both have pretty good CPUs. On the AMD side of things they have Ryzen 3, Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 9. With Ryzen 3 and Ryzen 5 being low to budget and mid-range sort of stuff, with Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 9 being more, let's just say, rich people. As for Intel, the system's pretty much the same. i3 and i5 are sort of budget, low-end hardware that gets you into the groove of things, whilst i7 and i9 are generally for professionals and rich people. It really doesn't matter what CPU you pick as long as you're happy with it and it offers performance that you need. Now to find out if your motherboard supports a CPU, all you have to do is find the motherboard on its website or on any website really, go to the spec sheet until you find a row that either says processor or CPU. Then you need to find out what generation the CPU is. Now, Intel, it's pretty standard. You've got 1 to 9, 10, 11. So that would be like an i5 11400. And the number in front is 11, so it would be 11th gen. But with Ryzen, it's a bit finicky. It'll say something along the lines of 1st gen, 2nd gen, and 3rd gen Ryzen. But with the addition of Ryzen 5000, it'll probably say 5000 series processors. And all this means is it's a processor that starts with 5. So let's say it's the Ryzen 7 5800X, that 5 is very key. Motherboards also come in a variety of sizes, being ATX, Micro ATX, and Mini ITX. Doesn't really make a difference, but if you want a smaller size motherboard, that's up to you. After you've chosen your CPU and motherboard, you'll need to find a cooler for it. Now, if you're using a Ryzen 3 or i5 or i3 or anything sort of low end, you can probably use the stock cooler. As fun fact, the Ryzen coolers are actually manufactured by Cooler Master. But if you have a higher end CPU like a Ryzen 7 5800X, you'll probably want to invest in a cooler, either air cooler or AIO. Now, AIOs, they contain liquid in them and it's sort of a radiator with fans. It's a little more confusing for a beginner builder, but with tower coolers and air coolers, they're pretty simple. Some recommendations for those would be the Noctua NHU12S or 12A. Whereas on AIO side of things, look for something Corsair or Cooler Master, as they're pretty good at that. There are other options for AIOs, but those are sort of the ones that I'm more familiar with. So now that you've chosen your CPU and motherboard, you have to choose your RAM. Now, when it comes to RAM, I recommend 16 gigs as it's sort of just future-proofing for the future, and many apps benefit from more RAM. But if you really can't, 8 gigs is fine, as long as it's in dual channel. Now, what this means is you've got 2 sticks put in the right slots on your motherboard, which sort of acts as a organization between RAM sticks, meaning the CPU can access different sides of RAM at a different time. Anyway, it boosts performance, and by a lot actually. So make sure you get 2 8 gig sticks or 2 4 gig sticks. Now for speeds in RAM, Ryzen does love fast RAM, and usually I recommend for Ryzen processors about 3200 MHz, but check what the CPU can support and your motherboard can support as well. Now for Intel, it's a bit iffy. With 10th gen i3 and i5 non-overclockables, You can't have anything faster than 2666. But with 11th gen you can have up to 3200 megahertz, and you'll just have to check your motherboard specs as well, again, to make sure that they're compatible with that. Next is storage. Now this is entirely up to you and how much you spend. You could go 120 gig drive, but let's be honest, you need a 4TB drive. I recommend getting an SSD to boot Windows off of, as that'll make things much smoother and faster. Not a hard drive, as hard drives are getting really slow and SSDs are just dropping in price, really. An M.2 SSD will be faster than the SATA SSD, and they're also easier to install and cable manage, but if you really can't fork out a bit of money, it's fine if you get a SATA SSD. How much storage you want is up to you, but personally I got a 500 gig SSD from WD. I then bought a 4TB hard drive for footage and games. Some standout brands for storage would be Seagate, Western Digital, and Samsung. Now that you've got storage, you need to find a graphics card. Now this is where it gets annoying, is because of the global silicon shortage, it's been very hard to find a graphics card in stock and at a good price. So I won't be accounting price into any of my thoughts and statements, as it will really vary where you are and what you're doing. There are two major competitors in the graphics card market, being AMD and Nvidia. Both are pretty competitive with each other and offer pretty equal amounts of performance. If you're looking to play games at 1080p high settings, I recommend an RTX 3060 or a 6600 XT, as they both offer really good performance for pretty good prices if you can find them. The main advantage of going with Nvidia is their DLSS and ray tracing cores. Now, AMD are getting into it slowly, but they don't have anything like DLSS yet. DLSS is an AI upscaler that upscales video resolutions like 1080p up to 4K, giving way more frames than if you just played at native 4K. AMD is slowly releasing their Fidelity Super Resolution, which is sort of their version of DLSS, but it doesn't work in the same way. It's an anti-aliasing technique, and to me it doesn't offer the same performance as DLSS, but that's just in my opinion. But it's also open source, which means that it can actually run on Nvidia GPUs, and they're actually encouraging it, really. So if you can, go Nvidia, but if you can't, AMD's fine, and it offers great performance. Now in terms of specs of a graphics card, I don't really recommend going 4 gigs, I recommend going higher. With 4 gigs, you won't really struggle that much with esports titles, but with harder games to run, like Warzone, you find that you run out of VRAM really quickly. So I recommend going 6 gigs or higher. I myself bought a 1650, but I'm happy with it. A great way to see what a video card's capable of is looking up videos to see testing in games. Now there are heaps of compilations made, and I actually made one myself testing out the 1650, so if you want to check that out, it'll be linked below. The last most important part of your PC is your power supply. Important things first is size. Now most standards are ATX, and this will fit in most builds, but if you're building a mini ITX build, it might not fit depending on what case it is, but again you'll just have to check. But ATX is usually just the standard. You should never skimp on a power supply, as it can often end in a fire, explosion, or just your PC blue screening over and over again, and it's not very fun. Did I listen to that advice? No. I bought a Corsair CV550. Now it's not inherently a bad power supply, I do recommend it, but it just means that I can't future-proof and I can't upgrade my PC as much as I would have liked to. Always make sure that you buy a quality power supply from a quality brand. Some standouts are Corsair and Seasonic. Seasonic make the best power supplies out there, if I'm going to be honest. Corsair are pretty good as their main brand, and they make good power supplies. The best way to determine how much wattage you actually need is go to your graphics card spec sheet. Now, this will often give a recommendation for how much watts you need, and I always recommend going 50 or 100 watts over that, as it also gives headroom. Each ARB board partner should list this under the spec sheet, but if they don't, refer to Nvidia or AMD's. Whenever you're picking out a power supply, make sure it has an 80 plus rating. Now this means that it goes from 80 plus white to 80 plus titanium. Now, I reckon you should go somewhere 80 plus bronze, 80 plus gold. You don't need to get to titanium unless you want extreme efficiency. But do not buy a power supply that doesn't have a rating, as that probably means that it might explode. Power supplies also have cable specs. Now, these specs are more so how the cables are attached to the power supply. Now, there are modular power supplies which don't have the cables attached and you can attach them as you like. Semi-modular power supplies which only have the necessary cables like 24 pin, 8 pin CPU power and 6 plus 2 pin PCI power. And then there are also non-modular power supplies that have all the cables sorted to the power supply. Now, as a recommendation, I recommend a semi-modular power supply because at least this means that you won't have extra Molex and SATA cables just lying around, and it gives you a little bit of freedom. But obviously I didn't listen to that and I bought a non-modular power supply, so now I have to cable manage. It's a nightmare, don't do it. As for cases, it really depends on what you want and what you need. Again, you can refer to your motherboard to see what your motherboard supports, as ITX motherboards fit in ATX cases, but I don't know why you'd want to do that. Whilst ATX motherboards, as they're the largest, obviously don't fit in an ITX motherboard case. For my PC build, I built on a micro ATX motherboard and a micro ATX case, which worked fine. It was just a little bit finicky, but as a beginner, I recommend probably using a micro ATX motherboard and an ATX case, as that gives you a lot of room for cable management and other stuff. That's pretty much it for me. If you did enjoy, consider subscribing, it helps out the channel a lot. Thank you for watching, and I'm TechBiz.
And I'm TechBiz.